Hi, I'm Wendy Conquest, and welcome to Conversations on Sex, Addiction, and Relationships. I'm here with my friends and colleagues, Tim Stein, Dan Drake, and Jeannie Vittoni. And today we're going to talk about what recovery looks like. So in our video conversation, Is It an Addiction? We talked about what addiction is and different types of addiction. Today, we're talking about the word recovery. Some people want to be cured of addiction. Today, we'll talk about if that's possible or not. And we'll also talk about what we see as successful recovery from addiction. Hi, guys. How you doing? So I got to tell you guys, my basement flooded on Friday night.
Ooh.
Why? How? It's the middle of summer. What's going on?
I know it. So I went downstairs and the carpet's like squish, squish, squish. And I'm like, I don't think this is right. I don't think this is a good thing. And you know what I realized is, well, first of all, the whole experience made me realize how freaking entitled I am. Like, you know, entitled to running water, entitled to hot water, and yeah. Entitled to a dishwasher and, you know, this machine doing dishes for me. So it ended up being a cracked drain pipe that was inside the wall. And let's see, so all weekend, everyone was saying to me, you got to find the source. You got to find the source. And so I'm, you know, going outside at 11 o'clock at night, turning on faucets and turning off faucets, you know, running back downstairs. But anyway, as of Tuesday, they came and found that it was a cracked drain pipe and it's fixed. And so it was an experience. What I think one of the things that it highlighted for me is how well or not well I handle stress.
Oh.
You know?
Yeah.
Well, it was a real way to
learn.
Yeah.
Which side of the fence did you fall there, Wendy?
I think I was falling on both sides of the fence through the weekend. I have to say my meditation helps a lot.
Yeah.
And so that was really, really helpful as pointing out one of my better resources. Also just talking to everybody I knew and saying neighbors, I got to know my neighbors much better. It really helped my sense of community. And I found out a lot about the history of the houses here. Like all of them flooded in the 2013 Boulder flood.
Oh,
wow.
That I didn't know. So it was a really amazing experience. Really amazing. Know my house better now, I guess. And myself better now.
Yeah.
The inside of your wall's better.
The inside of my, yep.
That's a beautiful metaphor. I mean, I just hear, you know, like in recovery, walk into the deep, dark depths of what's going on, and as painful and as difficult and uncomfortable as it is, coming out the other side, having learned more about yourself and the people around you and life in general and what you can actually do. That's I'm sorry your house flooded. I'm glad you got something out of it.
It was a choice. Either I go into the fetal position and just pretend it's not happening, or I engage with it. And so I chose to engage with it. And those mitigation fans they put in that sound like a jet airplane, those were interesting nights.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, don't you learn a lot about yourself when you walk in someplace and it's like just chaos or crisis or completely different than it's supposed to be?
Yeah.
So all is well. Your wall is re-plastered, re-intact, drain is fixed.
Oh no.
Okay. Because I was like, that's a really quick turnaround, Wendy.
No.
It's all okay.
The pipe got fixed.
The pipe
That's where we're at.
And you've pulled all the carpet out, or is that still to be done?
No, they took all of that out. They took all the carpet out, and they put the there's something to make sure things don't grow. And I don't know what that term is. And let's see. Yes, but the drywall still needs to be replaced. I need to figure out what to do with the floor.
Mm.
I'm thinking of one of those cool epoxy cement, the cement, put epoxy on the cement. I'm thinking of that, just in case it floods again.
I think that's brilliant.
So things are better, but there's still work to do.
That's right.
Isn't that life?
You know what I found too? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jeannie.
No, I'm done.
I was just thinking some of those, and I don't know what it costs to repair, one crack in a drainage pipe. If you had, I just think of some of that. That's not the fun kind of exciting work you want to do in a house, right? Like all the infrastructure, the pipes, but how critical that is, because once those things crack, it creates so much damage. Like I like to decorate the place, the painting, the moving furniture, the arranging stuff, all that kind of fun stuff. But that's just so like how critical the infrastructure is for this.
Well, I like that too as an analogy for recovery as well, right?
Yeah.
It's how many addicts love to put on a pretty face and a pretty persona and like to play, the perfect gal or the perfect guy, and then they're, they and no one else is looking at the infrastructure of the core of what's really going on.
Yeah, especially for our clients who have, working primarily in sex addiction, where there's so much shame involved. And I find, a lot of the clients that I see, they polish a nice exterior, they look good on the surface. You wouldn't be able to tell there's problems sometimes until everything blows up. But I often tell my clients, like, you don't need my help. You don't need to convince me of how good of a guy you are, or polish this exterior. You've done this. You've had enough practice doing that to the world. What you need my help with is the other guy, the other side of yourself. You don't want to show the world all the cracked pipes, all the things that you were kind of ignoring or not dealing with along the way. So
Yeah. So sobriety is no longer having a pipe that is leaking water all over the floor. Recovery is making sure there aren't other cracks in the pipe that are potentially going to create that leak, and then starting to sort of patch up, clean up, repair, get everything sort of back in an ongoing, workable state, and then the maintenance that keeps it there.
So I have a lot of clients that want to know the difference between slips and relapses in recovery. And so this is a term used a lot. These terms are used a lot in 12-step culture. And so can we talk about this?
I'm looking at Jeannie's face. I think she has something to say about this.
Okay, so let me slow down, because my brain just launches when I hear this word slip. And as you guys know, I work with addicts and partners, right? So I worry that the word slip is a minimization. So with the idea of slip, like, how does one define that? And I'm the piece about where we are, and our forte is sex addiction, but I am not myself well-versed in chemical addictions, drug addictions, alcohol addictions. So I don't know, do they define slips differently? Because people use the word slip as in, I did a relapse behavior, but I didn't do it for very long, or I stopped and I backed out of it, or something like that.
So does this feel
how do you guys describe slip?
Well, I think there's different ways we could define sobriety, right? And what that looks like. And there's different ways that people do that. I guess for alcohol, let's say I'm an alcoholic, what's that? Someone, instead of, drinking liquor, I had a beer, or that doesn't really fly with chemicals. Usually it's an abstinence model. Yes. So I think that's the difference we talked about with chemicals versus process addictions, that the goal of a process addiction recovery is not abstaining completely from the behavior. It's changing your relationship with the behavior. So yeah, I think, and also I'm curious now with slips versus relapse, because when you talk to, especially if we're talking sex addiction and this person's in a relationship, the betrayed partner typically doesn't have a nuanced appreciation of what a slip versus a relapse is. At least that's what I've experienced, versus, on the addict side that they may. So yeah, I guess your question, Jeannie, how do we define it?
Yeah, I'd be curious of how do you all define it? And then, I mean, I don't know, we don't have a substance addiction person here with us today, but if that world defines it differently, for me, okay, I'll just share me. No, there is no slip. And I also use the SAA model, Sex Addicts Anonymous 3-circle model. And so again, just for our listeners, that is a way of organizing and understanding one's addiction. Outer circle, self-care behaviors. Middle circle, I would say caution, beware behaviors. They might cause you or to trigger you or think about more sexual relapse. Inner circle behaviors. Inner circle is, if I do this behavior, I've relapsed. So in my mind, clarity is key. And so if you do an inner circle item, you've relapsed. It's not a slip, it's a relapse.
I think
Now with that, I want each person to individually decide for themselves, where is the line of relapse? For example, and this is what I'll compare when I do with alcoholics. Did you relapse when you walked in the bar? Would you consider that a relapse? Did you relapse when you ordered the beer? Did you relapse when you put the beer to your lips? Did you relapse when you drank from the beer? Like, everyone is different on that. And so I think that's part of the process of creating clarity about what are your relapse behaviors. But once you've done that, if you do one of those behaviors, it's a relapse. There is no slip. You might further define your relapse behaviors. But in my world, I have a real reaction to slip because I don't want it to sound like a minimization of an action.
I think
What about you guys?
on the addict side, I'll say, because I completely agree, because sometimes it's used to justify, well, I just did X, Y, or Z, and it wasn't that bad. Which may, on the surface, I think the distinction I often hear with a slip versus a relapse, someone may have engaged their bottom line inner circle behaviors. They may have crossed the line. And yet, what did they do after? Did they say, oh, screw it, I've already gone this far, I might as well just make it count, you know, and then they go on a bender for 2 weeks, versus someone who's like, oh man, I did violate my sobriety, but I'm going to go reach out to my sponsor. I'm going to go talk to my therapist or my support team. And then they get right back into recovery. To me, that's a big difference between what someone does post. It's not used to justify, but I do think there's a difference in how someone acts, you know, after they violate their sobriety.
I think that's
Absolutely.
really important also with a partner, because what I hear a lot is, okay, you know, you had a relapse, but you didn't do anything. You didn't use any of the tools of recovery. And so that's what I'm more upset about, because if you're not using those tools, then that's going to set you up to keep doing this behavior. And that's really scary for me.
I find, because Jeannie, I mean, obviously you and I work together. And so I've very historically fallen on the, I just avoid the term slip. And, you know, if you cross your bottom line, you know, it's a relapse period. One of the things that I am finding more recently with some of my clients is I think that there's a factor of time that goes into this as well. If I've got somebody who is in the first couple years of their sobriety, they're trying to get traction, they're trying to figure out what this looks like, I'm going to give them very little wiggle room. And so if they walk in and say this was a slip, you know, I'm going to say, no, we're not doing slips. It was either a relapse, you did it, or you didn't, because you really need to figure out that boundary. I find myself, however, with some of the people that are doing the advanced group work that I also sort of am involved with, I find some of those guys that are like 2-3 years sober, where they get in a point where they're working their program, they get a little squirrely, they don't go off the deep end of their addiction, but they cross over that boundary, but then they walk back immediately. They're bringing it to our group, they're talking about it, they're bringing it to their partner, and while if I had somebody who was like 3 months sober or 6 months sober, I would say that's a relapse. With these guys, I find myself sort of having a little bit of a different conversation, which is, you know, I could see that as a slip. I don't know that I would reset your sobriety, but there's also a piece, and I think this is really fascinating, is that it often opens up a conversation of, but if you do call it a relapse, does your sobriety date have more integrity? And does that integrity actually act as a springboard to strengthen your sobriety moving forward. So I find myself opening the door to slip as a term that I would be willing to consider with more time in program sobriety, solid recovery. Whereas early on, I almost eliminate it completely because I find it problematic.
My concern with the word slip is the concern that it's creating a loophole. And if you have clarity between what is and isn't, I feel like people have a better understanding of what they're going for, or what's acceptable to them in their recovery. And when you bring in the partner piece and the partner betrayal piece, it's usually a zero tolerance. Now, relapse does occur, and we need to plan for that and be thoughtful of it, especially when working with process addictions. And there's a difference of relapsing on one behavior versus another, typically for partners. But I don't want to encourage a loophole. So,
yeah.
And separately, I hear what you guys are saying about, like Dan, after the behavior, you know, what terminology. Absolutely, we're looking at how does the person come back from that? Do they hide? Do they keep the secret and keep going? Or do they bring it, get into transparency, talk about it with people? I would say that someone who is utilizing their tools, talking about it with their group, talking about it in their meetings, talking about their therapist, sharing it with their betrayed partner, that's good recovery. And someone's hiding or not, or overcome with the shame or whatever, they're not as much in a good recovery spot. So I wouldn't change the terminology of relapse versus slip, but I absolutely would acknowledge whether they're in good recovery processing it or maybe not so good recovery processing it.
You know, I'm thinking that the word slip came from the 12-step jargon of a slippery slope. And someone is in a slippery slope heading towards a relapse. I'm thinking that's where that terminology came from.
I've heard in the past people define a slip as I went into inner circle behavior, addictive behavior. It was a one-time incident. I pulled myself back out. I got back on program and I continued. Versus a relapse being I went into my addictive behavior and allowed it to become a pattern.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard that as well. And I think what's starting to happen in the recovery community is that people are trying to determine, well, when do I tell my partner and when don't I? Okay, I'm always going to tell my sponsor if they're doing 12-step work. But you know, if I'm going to tell the partner, if it's just a slip,
you hear that word?
just a slip, then
Ding, ding, ding.
I really don't need to. And so it brings in this whole idea of shame.
Mm-hmm.
And so in recovery, no one wants to go back into that old behavior. And yet a lot of times that's where they find themselves. And then they have to say, oh my gosh, now I have to tell my wife, my girlfriend, my boyfriend, my husband, I don't want to do that. That's going to be really challenging. That's going to be really scary. They said the last time if I did any behavior like this, I was going to get thrown out on the street and that I wasn't going to be able to see the kids anymore. So let's just not. Let's just pretend this just didn't happen. And that's a big problem.
Well,
huge problem.
Absolutely.
This is where we're talking about what is recovery, because sobriety, I sometimes shorthand it and say sobriety is about what we don't do. Recovery is about what we do. And so if we have a relapse, the relapse itself is a sobriety issue. What do I do after that is really recovery. Am I willing to be rigorously honest with my community? Am I willing to call the people and ask for advice? And when I make those phone calls, am I calling the guys who I know are going to say, oh, you probably don't need to tell her because it's okay? Or am I calling the guys who are really more couples, relational, partner sensitive, who are going to say, oh, wow, I know that's really tough. And I know you're really scared. And I don't know what's going to happen here, but you got to tell her or tell him or your partner, because it's really a matter of integrity and recovery and sort of how you're choosing to live your life and doing this in a very different way. And so there's that, what am I doing? Am I willing to walk into that situation and be rigorously honest and transparent and ask for advice from the people who are really gonna give me solid advice, not advice that I like and that's comfortable, but advice that's really gonna push me forward in living my life in a different way.
Tim, I love that different definition. Did you come up with that? Sobriety is what you don't do. Recovery is what you do.
I would
Did you-
love to take credit for that, but I know I heard it from somewhere else before.
I like that definition a
Good.
lot. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think sometimes people come into our, at least on the addict side, they'll come into my office and that's what they're focused on. What don't I do? But it's like, don't think of the pink elephant in the room. If I'm not thinking about the pink elephant in the room, what am I thinking about?
Yeah, the pink
Elephant
elephant.
in the room. So it's like, what am I focused on? It's still, if I'm focused on not doing something, my focus is still on that behavior. So what am I living for? What is recovery? What are all these pieces? How do I build back in, affirmations and healthy intimacy with my partner and with, other relationships? And how do I reach out to other people instead of isolating or doing, all those other kinds of recovery moves? So I love that too. I think it's a good distinction.
So
I
here,
want to get back to you,
here's-
Wendy.
Yeah,
I
go ahead.
want to go back to you because rigorous honesty is hard. It's a hard thing.
Define
yet-
rigorous honesty, Jeannie.
Truthful, even when it hurts. And I don't mean hurt them. I mean, is hard for you. Even though you have shame, you're working through it to tell the truth. Now, saying it to someone else, I want, be careful with all my pointing of my hand movements here. When sharing something about someone else, I want to be thoughtful about how I share that if it's going to hurt them. And people get hurt in relationships. We hurt each other's feelings. We need to learn how to manage the hurt, but being careful how you say something. But with rigorous honesty being one of the tenets of recovery, I want to come back to slip or relapse. Do I tell my wife? Do I tell my wife it's just this, it's just that? And like, minimization crazy land right there. But if you know that your wife would, or husband, girlfriend, boyfriend, partner wants to know, and it would be meaningful to them, and you don't tell them, then you've created a lie by omission. Now we're deeper in trouble here. Now we're deeper and repeating a traumatic experience of withholding information.
And you're walking
So-
into my favorite challenge for addicts, which is,
Okay.
why are you withholding that information?
Yeah,
Holding it because you're afraid that your partner is going to be upset, angry, or hurt. And so by withholding it, you're actually
protecting yourself.
No, you're emotionally manipulating your partner
yes.
so that their emotional state is more comfortable for you, which is the exact opposite of what you try to do in recovery in the first place.
Exactly. And that's what I meant by you're protecting. If I'm holding that because I don't want her or him to be upset and I don't want to hurt them further. And how many times have we all heard this? Well, I didn't want to hurt her or him further. Well, I
Well,
get that.
and
But
even
now you're
one
holding
step-
a lie.
One
So
step
that's all about
further,
you, my friend.
I agree, and I think that's a really important point, Jeannie, because people will use the phrase in the ninth step that
Yes.
they're in program, right?
Which is what, Dan? Which is what? Educate
Which you
listeners.
basically-
Well, let Dan finish.
Yeah.
You're in the ninth step. You're basically sharing your amends with other people, except when to do so would harm them or others. So they'll use that phrase as a way to say, okay, well, if I share this truth, rigorous honesty, it's going to hurt my partner. So therefore, if it's going to hurt them, I shouldn't share it.
Well,
But I 100% agree. It's not about,
Yeah.
who am I really protecting if I'm looking at it?
It-
Myself.
It'll even go deeper than that when people are breaking down the big book of AA, because Bill W. in there actually says, if we have done other indiscretions, such as, had infidelity outside of our marital relationship, should we tell our partners about that? And then he says, no, we shouldn't, because we've already done enough damage to them already with all of our alcohol stuff and all the stuff we put them through. We shouldn't tell them that. And so people will hear that and they're like, well, you see, I shouldn't tell them. And what they don't realize is that when we've gone back and looked at Bill W. in his life, he was a sex addict.
Tim, will you clarify who Bill W. was, please?
Yeah, Bill W. was one of the founders, along with Dr. Bob, of Alcoholics Anonymous. But Bill
This-
W. was a sex addict. He had affairs consistently and couldn't contain that. The AA program had to sort of like pull a lot of the administrative stuff out of his hands because it was going nuts. And to this day, a percentage of all big book proceeds go to his affair partner's family so that they wouldn't have said anything. And so when you understand that background, and then you see Bill W. say, well, we shouldn't tell him if we had sexual infidelities. It's like, well, of course, that's a sex addict who's not in recovery, coming up with a convenient reason with his addict justification for why he shouldn't do that. And so there's all this stuff that we have to go into. You don't like me going there, Jeannie?
I'm concerned that if we put something, yeah, that we're putting ourselves in a liable situation about with the affair partner's family stuff.
That's all.
So
That's actually all.
is it all public knowledge and well understood and well agreed to?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
And I don't know that I need to put that in there. I mean, I just find that interesting, but
Or Tim, you could say, this is what I've heard,
yeah.
you know. or
I
so
was
I've
going to
heard.
say, Tim, regarding what you were saying, okay, hold on. What you were saying, Tim, it shows again that difference between process addiction, sex addiction, chemical dependency as addictions. It's a total, don't tell and don't harm others. However, in the addiction that we are specialists, there's other people involved. It's in the relationship. Not that I understand that chemical and drug addiction is also impacting the relationship, but when we're addressing the intimacy, the sexual intimacy and trust, it's a little bit different or a lot different.
Yeah, so there's a big question that comes up a lot. Once, let's say a relapse happens, or once an event happens that is contrary to my sobriety, how long do I have before I have to tell my partner? Now, I have a 12-hour rule, but many therapists have 24-hour, 48-hour. And so I'm curious.
We actually do a 48-hour rule. And
Yes.
in the way that we do it is we tell the addict, you've got 24 hours to contact your therapist, your sponsor, other guys in program, let them know what happened, explore with them what boundaries you failed to hold, what choices you made, and what walked you down that path to relapse, and then explore with them how to share this respectfully with your partner. And then they have up to 48 hours from the time of relapse to share what they processed with and how that what happened with their partner. And so we do the 48-hour because I want them to have that process with other people first, because I don't want the addicts to, sometimes addicts use their partners as their higher power. I relapsed. I'm going to tell you, you're going to be understanding, and I'm going to take in that understanding and feel better about myself and get myself back on track. Or I'm going to tell you, you're going to be angry. I'm going to feel guilt about that. And I'm going to use that sense of guilt to get myself back on track, which is really, I'm using my partner as, my higher power to sort of get me back on my recovery path. And I don't want partners to be in that situation. It just feels manipulative to me.
I
And I also
understand.
want-
I do 12 hours. I do 12 hours because what I found over and over again, if it's longer, so if a slip happens at 5 o'clock at night, then they have until 5 o'clock the next morning. And the reason that I do that, or if it happens at 5 o'clock at night, they have till 5, the opposite.
Yeah.
And the reason that I do that is because what I've seen over and over again is that if more and more time goes and they don't use their recovery tools, they don't reach out, that addict mind starts going, and they have all these justifications of why it really wasn't a relapse and they really didn't do anything
It
wrong.
was just a slip.
And then it could be just a slip, or it really wasn't anything really. And so all the justification and minimalization comes in, and sometimes then it just goes, and they say, I have decided not to tell her. I've decided I'm going to process it. I processed it the next day with my sponsor, and we decided that it wasn't that big a deal. So what I want them to do is as soon as it happens, they're making their phone calls.
One of the
And
things
they're reaching out.
One
And
of
so
the-
I say, hang on. And that if they don't have a complete scenario to present in a partner sensitive, compassionate way, that they at least say to their partner, hey, there's been an event, I'm working on it, and I will get back to you. And then a date is set, because that gives the partner time to say, oh my gosh, an event. Now I have to get my resources together. I need to call my therapist. I need to call my support team, whether that's family. Maybe I need to set up childcare if this is going to be a big deal. I need to take care of myself, but at least I've got cues the cue that I'm going to be able to have time to do this.
Yeah. I
Dan?
will say, I want to hear what Dan does,
Mhm.
but I want to say real
But
quick.
I'm going to talk.
You know him so well,
I
Dan.
love you, Tim,
Yes,
so much.
as I was saying, I want to hear what Dan has to say, but
But are you going to share for me?
no. When you were talking about addicts sort of like convincing themselves, I've talked with people, I decided I'm not going to tell them. It is really difficult to get me to fire a client. But I will say one of the surest ways to get me to say I'm not willing to continue working with you is if you have a relapse and you decide to keep it a secret and not tell your partner about it. That just for me undermines the sobriety and recovery work that the addict is doing. It undermines the relationship. I think it's harmful to the partner, and I'm just not willing to work with somebody if they're gonna withhold that kind of information.
Do you tell them that like right up front?
I don't have a
Tim,
conversation
or-
with every addict up front, but
Yeah.
it is not an uncommon conversation where I'll say, when we talk about why you have to be rigorously honest, it often comes up, and I will share that with my clients and say, yeah, I'm not willing to work with people if this is what's going on.
And I appreciate that, Tim. I've been in situations where I feel like I'm colluding with a con, where I'm like implicitly gaslighting by saying, no, nothing's going on when there are things going on. And I hate that feeling in my own integrity as a clinician. So I really appreciate that. I was going to say a couple things. First, this is the conversation I don't want to have after relapse, by the way. So if I'm working on the addict side, and as hard as it is, I understand these are tough conversations that nobody wants to have with a couple of what is a plan, because it certainly doesn't justify a relapse by any means. This is not justifying it, but if worst case scenario happens and we do have a relapse, what's the plan? And I've hoped for the best sometimes and not had this conversation before with some couples. And then all of a sudden we're here. I'm like, well, I think your partner would want this, but I never actually found out. And that's not what I want to be doing. I don't want to be speaking for the partner. So hopefully the boundary, maybe I'm just simple, but the boundary, the partner says, this is what I want to know. And then I look at if it's an inner circle violation, there's no wiggle room. Did you violate your inner circle? And if you did, then you got to tell your partner because they wanted to know within this time frame. So maybe there's a bigger discussion of inner circle, and maybe there is something about changing the circles if there's something that needs to be adjusted. But to me, the other thing I wanted to say, Tim, you created this relapse autopsy, which I share with my guys, and I think it's really, really a valuable tool. It's a 12-page document that's not easy to go through, but yet it really helps them focus on what went wrong and what do I need to change my plan moving forward. And I found if they do that deep dive and they really invest in that, they're less and less likely to actually go down that path again. And their partners are going to also feel safer, like, oh, I'm actually trying to learn what the heck happened here.
Dan, did you say a 12-page document? What did you say?
It's
What's
12
it
pages.
called? Who created it?
Tim made it.
Tim made it. So Tim, clinicians, so I'm
Our
just
very
saying,
own.
okay, so clinicians that are listening to this podcast or watching the video cast, can they contact you? And is that for sale, or is there a way that they can get that?
Yeah, they can get it from me. I send it as a PDF to them. And all I ask is that they leave it on my letterhead so that Willow Tree and myself get credit for it. At some point, I've got a book in the makings that's going to be a part of. So at some point, I'll include it in a book. But the whole point of the relapse autopsy is, if you're going to relapse, I don't want you relapsing the same way twice. I want you learning from it, because really the only relapse that's truly worthless is the one you don't learn from. And so if you've relapsed and you can learn, what was it that walked me into this? What was the choice I made? What was the boundary I didn't hold? What was the situation that came up that really sort of pushed my trauma or emotional wounding? What was it that pushed me into this? And let me learn from that so that I can do something different next time. That's
What's
the point.
What's that document called, Tim? What's the document called?
It's called a relapse autopsy.
Relapse autopsy. And so if people want to get a hold of you, how do they get that?
They could email me directly at tim@willowtreesantarosa.com.
Dan, I love what you were saying about having that conversation, preferably before relapse occurs. And I know that I'm guessing most of us or all of us use some sort of relapse conversation during disclosure. I know Tim and I, when we do a disclosure, the second day, the very last thing we're talking about is what's the relapse agreement? And it's really
Jeannie,
an honor.
sorry, Jeannie, can you define disclosure, please, for those of
yes.
the audience that don't know what that is?
Absolutely. So therapeutic disclosure is when the addict is working with their therapist to do a full accounting of their sexual addiction history, as well as any other secrets, and bringing them forward in a truth-telling way. Betrayed partner is working with betrayed partner's therapist, creating questions that haunt them, that get in their way of healing, that they really need the answers to. And then that list of questions is given to addict and addict therapist, where that addict then creates answers, written answers. Then the four of us get together and the addict is sharing the document about the sexual behaviors, history, and any other secrets that are in play, and answering questions. Sometimes polygraph is involved, or eye detect, either on the front side or the back side of the disclosure, or both, to make sure we're doing as much as we can to make sure the truth is in the room. There's my little disclosure monologue. Okay, back to relapse agreement. So this disclosure process happens, it usually is a couple of hours, because there's dialogue and there's understanding of what's gone on. And everyone is very well prepared, by the way. There's lots of supports put in place and plans to do self-care. But the relapse agreement is, I agree to tell you these things in this kind of protocol. And that's where Tim's referring to 24 hours, community, therapist, and 48 hours to partner. And partner gets to choose in that process of what they want to know about. What are the key issues for them? And so I know a lot of professionals in our field have variations of this, but it does come to be a hard thing when, what if the relapse happens before the disclosure? And so timing of that kind of introducing, as clinicians, coaches out there, helping professionals, working with these couples, having that conversation before it's needed is really important. And my little throw out to the public would be, listeners, if you're in this situation and your helping professional hasn't brought this up, please bring it up with them. Be your own advocate, say, let's plan for this. How could this be? I don't want it to happen, of course, but if it does happen, how do I want it to roll? What do I want to be notified about?
Can I ask you, Jeannie, because I mentioned this earlier, but I often get partners get triggered by this, especially if it's I completely agree, but yet partners get triggered. I say, if we're having this conversation, it's almost like we're saying this is going to happen, or we're excusing it or okaying it. So how do you have that conversation, or what would you say to betrayed partners out there about this conversation ahead of time?
First is totally acknowledging that I get it, that they are fearful. If we're planning for it, then it will happen. And that's the fear. I really couch it in the being best prepared way. It is a step of preparation, because we don't want to be caught off guard of what do we do. And I don't want them caught off guard of what do we do. I often will say, you've had discovery in the kitchen while you're making dinner. You had no warning. There was no plan of what to do. So we're just trying to do our best planning now. And totally identifying that it's uncomfortable. We don't want it. It's not. And some people are like, it's not tolerated. If that happens, X, Y. And I say, okay, totally with you if that's what you need for yourself. And if it should happen, how do you want to be notified? So I still want to have that conversation. How do anybody else do anything different?
Well, I just want to say, I think there's a real way that the partner gets empowered in that process as well. So many times in this dynamic, the focus can go to the addict. The classic protocol was, addict centered. And so the partner was waiting, wondering, and there wasn't any support or help for her. And that paradigm has really shifted in the last, what do you say, guys? Maybe 15 years, something like that?
Maybe 10
years, 10 years. Yeah. So I'm really wondering, with the relapse prevention, how the partner can be empowered as much as possible. Does she then have a strategy of what she's going to do with different levels of relapse, what she considers different levels of relapse. And does she let the addict know? This is an interesting question, right? Does she let the addict know ahead of time, if you do this, then this is going to be the consequence. If this happens, then there's going to be a different type of consequence. What do you guys think?
I have a thought on that. This is a whole question on boundaries, which we probably have another conversation
I was like,
about.
that's a whole nother episode.
I love it. I was just going to say, I personally, having worked with partners, I mean, I like to say I'm among the options I may choose, I may do, the consequences I may have are these. I feel like sometimes partners, you're faced with a situation, you have non-negotiables or you have certain boundaries in place, and then it happens, and then you have to decide, do I want to enact this consequence I set up ahead of time? Or maybe I feel differently, or maybe it's, I thought I was going to do A, but now I really want to do B. So I've had some partners wrestle with, well, I said I was going to do this, but now I actually want to do this. What do I do? Am I keeping my own word now because of this? So my own thing, I don't usually say I will do X, Y, or Z. It's more of a kind of possibility. Yeah, potential. So
I use the word intention.
Yeah, by the way, to our listeners, so Dan wrote this amazing article called The New Scarlet Letter. And I would really encourage both partners and addicts to read that, because it's brilliantly written. And it basically talks about, well, I'll let you describe it, Dan.
Well,
Well,
it's basically, I mean, Esther Perel, I'll give her credit. So she talked about, staying after infidelity as the new Scarlet Letter in our society, obviously based on Nathaniel Hawthorne's work of the Scarlet Letter, where women back in the day would have to wear the Scarlet A if they were adulterers. And now I think there's this extra letter that partners, betrayed spouses and partners wear post betrayal of this extra stigma of staying after infidelity. I think there's this extra shame partners and experience. So, but it's actually more common than you think that many betrayed partners, it's easy to say, oh, if I had this happen to me, I would never stay with that jerk. I would dump that guy. But yet we never know, because it's not just, this person isn't just the jerk. There's also history, or there's kids, or there's financial entanglements, or there's love, there's also, it's complicated. So anyway, I just think we don't quite know what we're going to do until we're faced with a situation oftentimes. So
that's great. So in wrapping up, I'm thinking, I want to invite all the listeners to also listen to our podcast on betrayal trauma. That is specifically around partners. The gender doesn't matter, but we're going to talk a lot about that dynamic and the challenges with that. So as always, thank you so much for joining us in the conversation. You can like us on Facebook or your favorite social media. And if you have any questions, you can certainly email us. Thanks.
Hello and welcome to Conversations on, oh God, I didn't even remember that. Bad.
that was good.
Cut. Okay, stop.
That's
going to be a great blooper right there.
That's great. That's perfect.
What are we talking about?
I don't know what I'm going to do, something like that.
All right.
But when I get to a fist, do a mental.
Stacy, this is a well-oiled machine. Can't you tell?
And I should say only smart things. Want to keep it rolling just in case something crazy comes out of our mouths?
So how are we ending this? Did I end it?